Majboori Ka Rishta. This video was created to bring light to a pervasive problem within the Pakistani community in Canada. That problem being marriages of constraints and compulsion. Marriages where Canadian Pakistani women are made to believe that they have no option but to marry back home. And the men back home are so desperate to leave Pakistan that they use these women as an escape, with no respect for the sanctity of marriage. In simple words, this would be called marriage fraud. But by labeling it as such, it immediately brings about aggression and defensiveness from the immigrating spouse. And that prevents open dialogue and a chance for understanding and change within society. You see, both parties in these types of marriages identify as the victim, the sponsoring spouse and the immigrating spouse. So it is best to provide both points of views. I want to approach this issue from an unbiased perspective, trying to reveal the mindset of the sponsoring spouse and immigrating spouse. I will focus on female Pakistani Canadians sponsoring men from Pakistan. I would like to put out a disclaimer that not every marriage that is done overseas fails. Not every man who comes as a sponsored spouse is abusing the Canadian immigration system for his personal gain. No, in fact, there are plenty of overseas marriages that are thriving, full of respect, love, and commitment. That being said, there are also many incidents of abuse committed against Canadian Pakistani women by the spouses they sponsor from Pakistan. The amount of psychological trauma, social shame, economic loss, and domestic violence that ensues from such marriages requires that this issue be discussed. I did turn off the commenting to this video because after following several Pakistani Facebook pages, I realized that there is a lot of anger within Pakistani male youth, which often erupts into vile, derogatory language with violent sexual overtones that I would like to avoid having to read on my channel. Why did I use the word majboori, which is an act which is done in desperation or due to constraints? Because after a long analysis, I reached the conclusion that both parties, the bride sponsoring and the groom immigrating to Canada, enter this union due to various desperate constraints. These majbooriyan I will analyze for each party. There is no doubt that the sponsoring bride and her family can be abusive to the immigrating groom. But overall, the patriarchal nature of Pakistani society and present-day Canadian society serve to still maintain male privilege. This is demonstrated by the fact that Immigration Canada currently has no real punishment for marriage fraud, and socially it is the women who are shamed in Pakistani communities when these marriages fail. So why do Canadian Pakistani families take their Western-raised daughters to marry someone from back home, from Pakistan? To understand this, you have to understand the Pakistani diaspora in Canada. Many, but not all, in an attempt to maintain their culture and Islamic values, become almost hyper-conservative to protect their daughters from what they perceive to be the ills of Western society, such as immodest clothing, dating, and premarital sex. Ironically, sometimes these Canadian Pakistani girls are often raised in more conservative and restrictive households compared to their female peers living in Pakistan. For the Canadian Pakistani woman, a lot of factors come into play that often push her to go back home to Pakistan for marriage. I will discuss those factors now. Because she has been raised in Canada, she's labeled as modern, loose, not wife material. Because she will talk back, not conform, and not be submissive to her in-laws and husband. It is Pakistani Canadian men and their families who label Canadian Pakistani women as such. And as a result, these women are removed from the marriage pool and often overlooked. Canadian Pakistani men often head back home to Pakistan for what they believe are submissive, moral, respectful, and cultured wives. Some Canadian Pakistani men have grown up in households where their fathers often use derogatory and abusive language towards their mothers. They often hear their fathers demean their mothers, specifically about their appearance and incompetence. As a result, these men grow up viewing Pakistani women as inferior and unattractive, because this is what they have heard throughout their childhood. Many of these men will then marry out of the Pakistani community and even outside of the Muslim community. Some of these men marry out of the community to avoid the baggage of Pakistani culture and the constant battles within the marriage and with the in-laws. This further depletes options for Canadian Pakistani women. Some Pakistani Canadian parents are also wary of marrying their daughters to local Canadian Pakistani men because they have preconceived biases that these men are promiscuous, have had premarital sex, use drugs, and so forth. They think that men from Pakistan will at least have some Islamic morals because, after all, they live in a Muslim country. Canadian Pakistani parents, from my personal observance, marry their daughters earlier than their Pakistani peers because there is this great fear that their daughters will age out and be left with no options. They also marry their Canadian Pakistani daughters earlier to avoid the lure of Canadian society, which once again is dating and premarital sex. Lastly, having raised their daughters more traditionally can become a problem for Canadian Pakistani parents. Some Canadian Pakistani men, having been raised in Canada, do not actually want a traditional wife who wears the hijab and shalwar kameez. They want a wife they can show off to their friends and peers, who is able to maintain an aesthetically pleasing Western image. So these women become eliminated from the marriage pool. There is also a possibility that Canadian Pakistani girls have not achieved the level of academic and career success that a Canadian Pakistani family wants in a potential bride. This once again removes her from the pool of potential local Pakistani brides. Some Canadian Pakistani parents, bound by family bonds and a sense of brotherhood, prefer to go back home and marry their daughters within the family to extended relatives. Overall, these situations create a sense of majboori to head back home, whether it be lack of marriage options in Canada, protecting their daughters from what they perceive as an immoral Western society, or just maintaining family ties. For the Pakistani male, a marriage proposal from Canada alleviates a lot of his majbooriyan. A son is required to support his parents. Fathers in Pakistan often retire early and rely on their young sons to carry on the task of supporting the family. This support entails paying for the education of younger siblings, marrying off younger brothers and sisters, handling daily household expenses, upgrading the family property, and obviously a return on investment for supporting this son through his education. Corruption and bribery in Pakistan prevent young men from finding employment. This results in a lot of dissatisfaction and encourages hopes of immigrating outside of Canada. Sectarian violence and economic political uncertainty also push young men to look for opportunities outside of Pakistan. There are many ways to immigrate to other countries, but overall, Canada has comparatively very lax immigration policies, which attract people from all over the world. A spousal immigration is the cheapest way to immigrate to Canada as compared to coming on a student visa and paying double tuition, showing assets and wealth, or paying an agent to illegally bring them to Canada. The vast majority of men in Pakistan do not have these kind of financial resources to begin with. So, a spousal sponsorship is the easiest and most guaranteed way to enter the country. Social media has also introduced Pakistani society to Western culture, introducing them to concepts of dating, premarital sex, and free gender mixing. Many men feel the need to escape the conservative lifestyle in Pakistan for a more liberal and open society such as Canada. A spousal immigration out of Pakistan is not limited to a specific demographic, All men, rich, poor, educated, and uneducated, participate in this easy route out. In fact, the more educated males know that they are more in demand from Canadian Pakistani families, who are looking for stable and accomplished young grooms for their daughters. As a result, many of these men reject local Pakistani girls in hopes for a foreign match or rishta. There is also a noted tendency among some Pakistani males who feel it is their right to immigrate by any means necessary, some citing revenge for the atrocities committed by the British Empire. They come to Canada to loot its resources as the British did India and Pakistan. The root of this mentality is frustration at seeing Canadian Pakistanis living better lives while they are trapped in Pakistan. Historically, in the 1980s, a lot of blue-collar men immigrated to Canada and started families. These men were technicians and came from poor backgrounds. Their version of Pakistan, which they left in the 80s, was of a more simple time. Struggles, family unity, and a great deal of hardship. These men, when they go back to marry off their Canadian Pakistani daughters, are facing a new Pakistan, a Pakistan of corruption, greed, and high sexualization of women. The grooms that they find for their daughters are often from a higher class than which they belong to, and more educated than them. When these grooms arrive in Canada, they have a sense of superiority over their blue-collar father-in-laws. Some of these Pakistani men are also forced, like Canadian Pakistani females, to marry in the name of maintaining family bonds. Those using marriage as an opportunity to immigrate from Pakistan are often well versed in regards to the Canadian immigration laws and their rights. They therefore conduct themselves accordingly upon arrival to Canada in order to avoid deportation. The marriage takes place in Pakistan, obviously, and is often done with great revelry. Often the bride's family will bear a large portion of the expenses. Usually there is no warning sign of deception from the groom's family, as they know that their good behavior now will open doors for the entire family as soon as their son settles in Canada. The bride will often be treated with love and receive gifts, not suspecting any foul play. The groom's family will make no demands in regards to jahez or dowry, as they often do in Pakistani society, and they will insist that all they want is for the couple to be happy. These statements will win over the bride and her parents. When the bride returns to Canada, she will be inundated with messages of love and longing, a sort of emotional trapping and grooming. Relationships of Majboori often fail because of the inequalities where one partner is investing more than the other. In an attempt to win over the affection and loyalty of her immigrating spouse, the female sponsoring will pay the majority of fees for his immigration from Pakistan to Canada. It is understood that the bride and her family will be required to provide housing, furnishing, a car, and so forth, because the man arriving is obviously empty-handed. His education will not automatically be accepted in Canada, so it is also understood that the bride and her family will financially run the marital home until he finds suitable employment or completes his upgrading. As you can see, that is a lot of investment from one side. The groom rarely feels a sense of gratitude towards the Canadian bride and her family, but often cite that it is their daughter, and if they want her to be happy, then they should be doing these things. It was noted in the 90s, well into the 2000s, that many Pakistani men arriving as sponsored spouses just vanished at the airport, with the bride and her family left quite shocked and humiliated. These men knew that as a sponsored spouse, they had automatic permanent resident status in Canada and could not be touched. Others who would stay made lives miserable for the bride who sponsored them. They created a situation of abuse which would force the female to leave the marriage, thus removing all blame from him. Some tactics used are financial demands of money from the bride and her family, demands that the bride and her family buy him a car or purchase a home, demanding the bride to find rishtas or spouses for his siblings in Canada so that they can come as sponsored spouses as well. Demanding that the bride and her family help in sponsoring the groom's parents and siblings. An unrealistic critique of the bride's ability to be a good wife. Constantly critiquing the bride and her family, labeling them as modern and uncultured because they lived in Canada. Promiscuous behavior. Many of these men grew up in conservative homes. Coming to Canada opened doors which were previously denied to them, those being of interacting with the opposite gender and having extramarital affairs. If the bride and her family fails to provide the lifestyle the groom expected or fail to sponsor his parents and siblings, then violence often ensues in the form of verbal and physical abuse. For these men, immigrating to Canada is the first step necessary to sponsoring their family and bettering their lives. These men often have a singular focus when arriving in Canada, which is to sponsor their parents and siblings. As a result, many will fill out elevated incomes to Revenue Canada to achieve this or commit various forms of fraud. It is understandable that the groom will want to sponsor his family, but what makes it painful is that it is all at the expense of the bride. She is secondary. If she does not support his goals, she is instantly disposed of. If she declines, she is automatically deemed a bad wife, despite the fact that she and her family have invested thousands of dollars into the marriage already. At present, there are no laws to protect the women who sponsor husbands from back home. At one point, the Government of Canada required spouses and partners to live with their sponsor for 2 years, and marriage fraud could be prosecuted with the sponsored spouse being deported if enough evidence was found, but this condition was removed in April 2017. The sponsoring spouse is legally required to take care of their spouse's financial needs for up to 3 years. So even if the groom does run away, but for some reason ends up requiring welfare or social assistance, the bride whom he left will be required to pay for this. A lot of Canadian Pakistani parents who marry their daughters back home are unaware of these laws and are therefore shocked when they contact authorities about such grooms, realizing that they have very little rights and very few options. Canada is a safe haven for immigration fraud, and this should be clearly understood by Canadian Pakistani families and potential brides going back home. Ignorance is not an option. These marriages often end with either the groom running away or the marriage ending within the first 2 years, with the groom blaming the bride to be incompatible, poor wife material, argumentative, and so on. The Pakistani groom often tactically slanders his Canadian wife, labeling her disrespectful to him, his family, ill-mannered, and overall a poor quality wife. This garners a lot of support in the local Canadian Pakistani community, which to its core is patriarchal. As a result, these men are absolved of all blame for the marriage ending and are not accused of abusing a female of the community to get into Canada. Unfortunately, it is the women who are shamed by the local Pakistani community or at the masjid or mosque that they attend. And they are often ostracized if they seek legal action or call the police. The men, on the other hand, are often given shelter, assisted with the immigration process, and even given marriage proposals. The reasons why these men are able to exploit their Canadian Pakistani brides is likely because they have not invested as heavily into the marriage as the bride. And if you haven't invested your own money and hard work into the marriage, you feel little remorse about it ending and have very little need for reconciliation. Some Pakistani men, much like some Canadian Pakistani men, hold the belief that their Canadian Pakistani brides have probably had illicit relationships prior to marriage, lack morals, and needed to be quickly married to someone in order to prevent shame. Based on this thought process, they do not view their bride with respect and therefore feel no remorse when leaving them. These men have a lot of pressure on them from their parents and siblings to sponsor them and send money back home. These men are not given an opportunity to build a relationship with their wives. Instead, fairly early into the marriage, the demands for money and sponsorship begin. While these men are being pulled in one direction from their parents and siblings back home, their Canadian bride holds the expectation that he is their spouse and should be primarily committed to the marriage and contribute towards it. If the marriage lasts long enough and children are added to this mix, a very bad situation results. Because children require love and attention, care for their physical, emotional, psychological, social, and spiritual needs. And these men just do not have the resources or time to be a present and participating father. These men are pulled in so many different directions that often they take their rage out on their wife and kids because it is not possible for them to say no to their parents and siblings. These marriages, if they continue, often result in high levels of domestic violence, abuse, or divorce, with the bride's family eventually having to support not only the bride, but the children that have been born from this marriage, while the groom works to support the family back home. What can be done? I can't say don't go back home to get married, because the inequalities Canadian Pakistani women face leave no other option at times. Unlike their male peers, they cannot marry outside of their culture or faith without being excommunicated by their parents. I can only encourage informed decision-making for the potential bride and her parents. Be aware of your legal rights or your lack thereof. There is no harm in marrying late as opposed to rushing into an overseas marriage for it to only end within 2 years. The bride and her parents must understand that it is absolutely expected from the Pakistani groom that you will assist with sponsoring and settling his family and assist him in all financial matters. If you don't have the financial resources, then please don't enter these unions. For the men using marriage as a means to immigrate to Canada, I ask that you at least be honest and accountable. Be very upfront about what your plans are, what you expect from the bride and her family, and please do not have kids if you cannot bear the responsibility. Yes, if you are honest, it will limit your marriage options, as most people will not realistically want to be responsible for economically supporting you and your family for an extended period of time. But at least your conscience will be clear. You will not have deceived someone. To the bride's parents, if you have married your daughter back home and she is now in a volatile situation, please end the marriage. There is no point in dragging it out. Don't worry about what people will say. Accept the fact that you have been taken advantage of and protect your daughter from further harm. Yes, you have invested heavily in this marriage, but the longer it continues, the greater your financial loss. It's okay if she is divorced, because the longer you wait, the more damaged she will be when she leaves. Please, do not force her to stay or beg the groom to stay. Just end it. Two people forced together due to their majbooriyan will do desperate and dangerous things to leave this marriage. Relationships that are made in majboori, a desperate compulsion, never thrive. Please do not act in majboori.